Grace and peace be to you. It is truly a blessing and a privilege, and I would say a pleasure to be here with you on this afternoon to share on this CPE day, which I have a strong heart for, being a hospital chaplain and an ACPE certified educator. So I am grateful, and I am just looking forward to our time of sharing. And I am from the Black church tradition, so a little talk back won't hurt anybody, amen? A little call and response is all right. Amen. I just want to talk to you for a few moments from the thought when tragedy strikes. When tragedy strikes. When great trees fall, rocks on distant hills shudder. Lions hunker down in tall grasses, and even elephants lumber after safety. When great trees fall in forests, some things recoil in silence, their senses eroded by fear. When great souls die, the air around us becomes light, rare, sterile. We breathe briefly. Our eyes briefly see with a hurtful clarity. Our memory suddenly sharpened, examines, gnaws on kind words unsaid. Promises, promised walks never taken. Great souls die, and our reality, bound to them, takes leave of us. Our souls, dependent upon their nurture, now shrink, wizened. Our minds, formed and informed by their radiance, fall away. We are not so much maddened as reduced to the unutterable ignorance of dark, cold caves. And when great souls die, after a period, peace blooms, slowly and always irregularly. Spaces filled with a kind of soothing electric vibration. Our senses restored, never to be the same. Whisper to us, they existed. They existed. We can be and be better, for they existed. This poem, When Great Trees Fall, written by the late and great civil rights activist and poet Maya Angelou, was written in 1987 after the death of her friend and fellow activist and writer James Baldwin. The poem, which Angelou read at Baldwin's funeral, examines the death of great people, comparing them to great trees falling in a forest. Just as those massive trees shake the earth and make animals crouch in confusion and fear, the loss of great people sends shockwaves throughout the world and in the souls of those they touch. Eventually, however, people's grief and despair give way to the invigorating knowledge that the world is a better place because those great souls existed, because those great souls made an impact, a mark in the world that would never be erased. When Great Trees Fall was collected in Angelou's 1990 book of poems, I Shall Not Be Moved. As I considered the death of Moses as outlined by the Deuteronomistic historian, Maya Angelou's words came flooding to my mind and enveloped my senses. Imagine with me for a moment the impact of Moses' death on the community that he led for decades. Moses answered God's call, demonstrated signs and wonders, spoke truth to power to Pharaoh, demanded that he let God's people go. demanded liberation and freedom for God's people. He led them from slavery to freedom, crossing the Red Sea on dry ground, encouraging them when they were afraid, and instilling calm during the most turbulent moments of their journey. Moses was their leader, journeying with them in the wilderness for 40 years as people died along the way and a new generation was born. Moses delivered God's law to the people. He settled their disputes, offered them guidance, and cared for them, and he got mad at them too and hit that rock. He was their great tree. And now, after getting a glimpse of the land of promise, but not actually entering the land with the people, Moses dies. The great tree falls. Still strong and sharp as ever at the ripe old age of 120 years old. I imagine that after all the people had been through with Moses at the helm, they weren't ready for him to die, especially before making it to the promised land. I mean, who is actually ever ready? Who's ready to say goodbye to those they love? Especially people of such great significance as Moses. This was a communal tragedy, as Israel's first leader would lead them no longer. Moses' death and timing of it all was not a part of the plan. As a chaplain in the hospital setting and as a parish pastor, I have seen this scene play out time and time again. Loved ones gathered around the bedside, attempting to make sense and make meaning out of something that absolutely makes no sense and has no meaning. The mother who won't be around to see her children graduate from high school. That grandmother who beat cancer 2 times only to die of COVID-19. The father who woke up one morning and went to work as he did every day, only to be involved in a horrific accident on the job that unfortunately claimed his life. These people, these pillars of the family, these wise sages, these role models, these leaders, these matriarchs and patriarchs, these great trees have fallen. But they were supposed to be around to experience the promised land. Their own visions and hopes for the future, to see their kids all grown up, the expansion of the family business, the senior prom, the high school graduation, the birth of that first grandchild. But now that great tree has fallen. Tragedy has struck the family, and life, as they've known it, will never be the same. They weren't supposed to die now. Death, this unwelcome friend, has arrived and shattered their hopes and dreams. Friends, this is the chaplain's bread and butter. Odd as it may seem, just as firefighters run into the burning building, chaplains live for this. Being present and walking with people at the intersection where the collision of deeply embedded hopes and the shocking and heart-wrenching reality of loss, death, and grief insurmountable comes alive. People who mean so much to those gathered at the bedside, like Moses meant to the children of Israel, though they may not have had the stature of Moses as a leader of an entire group of people. Trust me, in a family, people can loom just as large. That's what I hear often at the hospital as people say goodbye. They begin to tell the story. Stories of how Big Mama made it over. Stories of adversity and triumph. Stories of legends and the legacy they leave behind for the living. Those gathered speak well of their loved ones, just as it is written of Moses in verse 7. His eyes were not weak and his strength was not gone. They say things like, Mama Connie was 92 years old, still working out there in that garden. Daddy was 80 years old, still working on the family farm. Mother was getting chemo once a week, and even though she wasn't feeling well, she went to that bus stop to pick up those kids every day that she could. Chaplains bear witness to these stories about the deceased and their impact on those who live on. Chaplains make space for precious words to be uttered in these tender moments as shock is absorbed and heartfelt sentiments are expressed. The eulogy, which is formally given at funerals and memorial services, actually often begins more informally in spaces like hospitals or at the home where family members gather in preparation for the first of a series of goodbyes. Chaplains provide platforms for legacy talk, precious memories, and deep and meaningful reflection. Chaplains also make space for grief in the many forms it may take. One thing that I really like about this text as a chaplain and as a pastor is the way in which grief is upheld. Verse 8 says that the Israelites grieved for Moses in the plains of Moab for 30 days until the time of weeping and mourning was over. Now just think about it. These folk, they got a promised land to get to. They've been wandering around for 40 years. Y'all know they're ready. They're on their way somewhere. They're on the precipice of moving into what they consider to be their divine destiny. They're so close. Timing couldn't be worse. They're almost there. Now they got to grieve. Moses announces to them back in chapter 31 that he will die and not be going with them to the promised land, and then he dies. And what the chaplain in me really appreciates about this is that the people spend 30 days mourning the death of Moses. They didn't push past the grief because they had things to do and a promised land to get to. Everything stopped to allow space for them to work through their individual and their collective sadness and loss. They leaned into it and sat with it and tended to it. And I suspect they tended to each other. I think about the society in which we live, the rat race, which can be all-consuming. Things are quite different, aren't they? The grief policy set by Israel's HR department was 30 days. Where I work, at the Ohio State University, you get 5 days of bereavement time and you got to get your tail back to work. But only if the deceased is a close relative. Mama, daddy, sister, brother, grandma, grandpa, auntie, uncle, or child. 5 days, not even a full week. How does one process grief in 5 days? How does one deal with this kind of pain in 120 hours and then be ready to go back to work? I can recall the dread I felt when my father died once I returned to work. How was I possibly going to go to a hospital room and respond to a death when I was still getting over my daddy? And not just that, but one's relationship to the deceased is also a factor. So when the Moseses in our lives die, the leaders and the key influencers who had a major impact on us, because they may not be our blood relatives, because they're not our kinfolk, we're technically, if you work at the Ohio State, you're not going to get your 5 days of bereavement time. Maybe your Moses was a teacher or a mentor or a coach who took you under their wing and invested in you. Maybe your Moses was a pillar in your community. It hurts just as much as it would a family member. Time to grieve that loss. Time to process what that person meant to you. Time to consider what life will be like without them. That time is precious. That time is necessary. That time is a prerequisite for moving on in a healthy way. But we don't often get that time. We don't often give ourselves that time. After the 30-day period of mourning, the people were prepared to follow their next leader. There was now space for them to make room in their hearts for someone else to guide them. I believe in part because they had been able to grieve. Not to say they don't miss Moses, that they won't think about him, but they've got room now for Joshua to come in. One of the meaningful aspects of a chaplain's work is making space for people to grieve. Now, often this grief is raw and it occurs in the moment, often in the form of anticipatory grief before a death occurs, during the dying process, and at and following the point of death. Hospice chaplains provide ongoing bereavement support for a year or so following death. The sacred act of allowing space for grief communicates to the bereaved that it's okay for them to feel however they feel. It's okay for them to take time to mourn the loss. Friends, this is a gift. And the last thing I'll leave you with is found in verse 9. Now, Joshua, son of Nun, was filled with the spirit of wisdom because Moses had laid hands on him. Now, this is absolutely beautiful. Moses lives on in Joshua. Moses continues to remain with the people through the spirit of wisdom imparted into their new leader. Moses' legacy will be visible and embodied as the community moves forward without his physical presence with them. This great tree had fallen, but his spirit would remain with the people now and in future generations. Though there was a tragedy that impacted the whole community, Moses' legacy would have an enduring impact on them as well. People often reflect on what their deceased loved one has left with them: wisdom, kindness, compassion, skills in the kitchen. Y'all know grandmama's recipes can solidify cooking for future generations. Leadership, love of family, deeply rooted spirituality, and so on. I am this way. I have this ability because it is what my loved one imparted into me. What have your loved ones left you with? How does their legacy live in you? Some of you all are sitting right here in seminary because somebody imparted the kind of faith and spirituality in you that you wanted to minister to other people. When providing support to people who are grieving in the ministry of chaplaincy, as well as in parish ministry, meaning making through legacy is so important. Exploring with people the answers to the questions like, who was this person to you? What did they mean to you? What did they leave you? How has your life been shaped by their presence with you? These questions and conversations are such important parts of dealing with the tragedy. Giving people space to reflect on the life that was lived is sacred. It's holy. Just as the case in the ending reflection of Moses in our pericope, since then no prophet has risen in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face, who did all these signs and wonders the Lord sent him to do in Egypt to Pharaoh and to all of his officials and to the whole land. For no one has ever shown the mighty power or performed the awesome deeds that Moses did in the sight of all Israel. People reflect on the legacies of their loved ones, just like this reflection in Deuteronomy. Grandmama was the glue that held this family together. No one else in our family could do that. My father had a way of bringing a sense of calm to any and every situation. No one else in our family has ever been able to do that. My sister's smile was infectious. She could light up any room. No one else could light up a room like my baby sister. My mother instilled in us the value of pursuing an education, of paying it forward, of embodying the adage, each one teach one, of serving others. No one else has been able to impact me the way that she has impacted me. Yes, it is true. Tragedy strikes us all. No one is exempt. No one escapes. No one is off the hook. But in the midst of the tragedy, there's beautiful legacy. There's community. There are precious memories. Oh, how they linger. Tragedy strikes, and the legacies of the departed shape us, shape our life course, ground many of our conscious and unconscious decisions and sense of purpose. These are the gifts our great trees leave us, which enable us to live into the last stanza of Maya Angelou's poem. And when great souls die, after a period, peace blooms, slowly and always irregularly. Space is filled with a kind of soothing electric vibration. Our senses restored, never to be the same. Whisper to us, they existed. They existed. We can be and be better, for they existed. Amen.